Merry Christmas, Internet. I have a Christmas Cookie Monster sweater on. So, I have a question for you. Have you ever met someone that thinks in a way where you admire their brain? You really, really are like, wow, they have a pristine, interesting mind. That was the origination of this week's research. So I have a long list of individuals that I admire because they have the capability to make connections of completely different areas that I feel like sometimes I'm not able to. And I know this is something that's built over time, but when you just see someone like that, you're like, wow, I really admire that brain. And so I decided to figure out how I could do that. So this week, I decided to start off the week researching assumptions that I had around these people's brains that I admired. I assumed that these people were very logical and rational and had a very scientific process around thinking through things. And I started researching scientific thinking and the scientific process and learned a lot. It was interesting, but I basically went down a rabbit hole asking the wrong question, which is fine, that happens sometimes. And I came to the conclusion after basically realizing that scientific thought sits within a wider umbrella of kind of logical, rational thinking or analytical approach to thinking. And that sits inside of a bigger umbrella, which is kind of mental models. So I probably after, I'd say, 6-7 hours of research, I stumbled across this realization and then started asking different questions. And the questions I started asking myself are, if this is the way people think, then do they have mental models or heuristics or rules of thumb that they use in their head that they've built up over time? And this led me to other research, which was quite interesting. When coming into this research, I had this belief or this kind of false assumption that mental shortcuts or rules of thumb are a lazy way of thinking, where you basically say, yeah, it's roughly this, or based off my previous experience, I think this, instead of actually thoroughly going through and analyzing what the situation is and what you should do on the situation. But after doing some digging, I realized that this is the way that we're wired. And I came across some interesting research, and I'm going to basically explain kind of 3 big things to you right now. And in the post that I wrote, you can go out there and check it out. But that post basically talks about the how we are naturally lazy in our minds, and how that's okay, and actually how that's justified. And then additionally, I talk about different types of mental models that are interesting to me and that I've come across, and some other bits and pieces. And throughout this entire post, there's tons of links, tons of videos and articles and lectures and books and all that stuff, so feel free to check that out. The first thing I want to start with here is that it's okay to have a lazy brain, basically. And the thing I want to start with is that our brains are biologically created to conserve energy. The purpose of these things in these wet sponges in our head are basically to make sure that we survive. And to make the effort to think through something, to really kind of put your mind to it, energy and time, that hurts and that's painful. And the first thing I want to talk about here is 2 systems of thinking. And I pulled this from a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And there's actually a video that I want to show a bit of here.
Now, one way of modeling how the brain operates is as though there are 2 systems at work. Psychologists call them System 1 and System 2, but maybe it's useful to think of them as characters. So let's call System 1 Gun and System 2 Drew. You are Drew. He represents your conscious thought, the voice in your head.
I am who you think you are.
He's the one capable of following instructions. He can execute a series of steps. If you're asked to calculate 13 times 17 in your head, for example, he's the one who has to do it.
Can I just use my calculator?
No.
All right. 7.
And this is Veritasium, a YouTube channel, and they've done a great job basically showing you exactly what the 2 different types of thinking are in your head. And after watching the video, I'm sure you have a gist of it, but there's System 1 and System 2. And system 1 is basically the fast, reactionary, intuitive part of your brain, and system 2 is the more slow, logical, and analytical part of your brain. For example, you could think, if I say, what's 2 plus 2? You're automatically going to intuitively, quickly respond to that. But if I say, what's 27 times 34? You're going to have to kind of sit back and say, okay, well, then you have to kind of do the math and think it through. This is a really surface level kind of explanation, but the more you think about this concept, the more you realize it comes up in your day-to-day situation where you're either trying to learn a new skill of an instrument, you're trying to learn a new complex topic, I don't know, like quantum computing, or if you're trying to basically understand the social dynamics of a certain country. They're trying to all these, like, these are complex things that you have to think about and take time to train your system 2 with. But once you've understood that in system 2, and once you've kind of grasped that concept and built that into your routine in your days, then that actually starts to seep into system 1, where all that energy you're putting into it actually starts to get stored within system 1, where you can think of, you have these chunks of thoughts and chunks of ideas and chunks of skills in your head. And the more of these models, if I could say, mental models you build up in your war chest, which is your mind in system 1, the more you can refer to them easily. And this is quite interesting to see that we have 2 different forms of thought, and basically the thing I took away from this is that the more you can build up your pain tolerance of working in system 2 and funneling those skill sets, concepts, and ideas into system 1, the bigger your war chest, then the better off you might be when facing different problems and opportunities in your life. The next thing I want to touch on here is that it's okay to use system 1 more often, meaning it's okay to use your mental model, your heuristics, or your intuition instead of rationalizing your way through life. And there's this individual named Gerd something, I can't say his last name, who has a concept, an idea, and I'll play a short clip here.
In a different world, the world of uncertainty, calculation is not enough. You need smart rules of thumb that are technically called heuristics, and good intuitions, which are also based on smart rules of thumb.
And I'd recommend you check out this video, go take a peek at it. But in a nutshell, basically, him and a whole group of kind of thinkers from different areas and different realms of ideas all kind of go around this idea of bounded rationality and how we as individuals and our minds are basically limited, and we're limited by our cognitive power, so like how much power do we have in our minds, and then the other piece is time. How much time do we have to make decisions? And their argument is basically that we live in 2 worlds, right? So the majority of the time we live in an uncertain world where we don't necessarily know all the different situations, we don't know all the different scenarios, we don't understand all the probabilities and all the different variables that come into this decision because it's so wide. And then the other one is kind of a certain world, and it's finite, and we understand all the risk. An example that he gives for the finite one, so the one that we understand the risk, that's like going to the casino. So if you go to the casino and you make a bet and you throw the dice, you understand that if you do the math behind where the dice will land, the probability of it getting to a certain combination of dice and all these different things, you can rationalize your way to figuring out if you'll win or if you won't. But in the uncertain world, where we basically live the majority of our lives, if there's a situation where you basically say you have a move, so you're going to move for a job or you're going to move to a different location for family. And when making that move, you have a long list of considerations you have to make, and there's too many things to actually truly understand what the actual opportunity is, or the decision you have to make. So when thinking about this, there's so many things that come into that. It's almost impossible not to use heuristics and rule of thumb. And it's interesting because in his argument in the lecture that I'll link below or in the post, he explains exactly why it's actually better to use heuristics than to rationalize your way through it. And it's mainly because of time constraints and also the constraints of information that you have access to make the decision. So that was quite interesting. The next thing I want to tell you about is mental models. So when I started this journey of this research, I realized that, okay, most people use heuristics or mental models or rules of thumb because our brains are lazy. It's okay to do that because of the bounded rationality concept I explained, and then what all the other stuff Gerd and his group explains. And then after realizing that, I realized, okay, well, if that's the case, then what are the mental models and heuristics that these people I admire, what are they using? And what am I using today? And what mental models are out there and that exist? So I started kind of going on this journey figuring that stuff out. And what I'll do here is I'll just explain 2 interesting mental models that I came across. And I'll link in the post tons and tons of them. You can check them out yourself. But the 2 that I wanted to mention here that I thought were quite interesting, one is second order thinking. And there's a diagram I'll show here which shows basically you take an action and then there's a consequence. But most people don't necessarily think past the first consequence of the action. But there are multiple consequences. So if I do A, then B happens, and then I stop. I'm like, okay, that's good. But what about C, D, and E? The additional consequences of what could potentially happen afterwards. So it's interesting to kind of, how can you think through further on your decisions? And I thought this is interesting, and I think it's something that I definitely want to research more and apply to my own life. But kind of thinking about the additional situations or the additional consequences of what you do is quite interesting. So it's second order thinking, that's what it's called. And there's actually a part in the blog where they talk about different ways that you could actually apply this to your life. And the 2 things are basically that I'll put up here on the text from the blog is you ask yourself, and then what? And then after asking yourself, and then what, there's another thing you can do is say, if I do this, basically what happens in 10 minutes, what happens in 10 months, and what happens in 10 years. So you're really kind of thinking far into the future. So these are kind of 2 triggers you can use when trying to do second order thinking. So the next one is sunk cost fallacy. So I'll play a quick video here of an individual speaking about it on Big Think.
And the sunk cost fallacy then means making a choice not based on what outcome you think is going to be the best going forward, but instead based on a desire not to see your past investment go to waste.
And as you can tell, the premise of sunk cost fallacy is basically that you've dedicated time, energy, you've identified with something, you've put money into something, and now that you've committed to this, you're afraid to make future decisions that are kind of straying away from the commitment you've made. So once you've made this commitment, then all the decisions you make forward are kind of attached to this. And an example of this would be, say, okay, you're reading a book and you're 100 pages into the book and you've already committed 100 pages of reading to this book, so you're going to keep reading it until you finish. That is sunk cost fallacy. So instead of reading further into the book, you just put it down and say, this book isn't good enough, it's not worthy, I'm going to stop. Another thing that I've gone through, which is programming. So for me, I dedicated 8 months to basically every spare moment I had to web development and the fundamentals of computer science. And after doing coding for a while, I realized that living the life of a programmer on a daily basis, fixing bugs and building out features, isn't necessarily something I want to do 24/7. So I thought that since I dedicated so much time to this, I have to continue doing this. But then I realized that that is the sunk cost fallacy in action. And I need to realize that this time was spent well, but I need to make a pivot to something that's more enjoyable. So it's quite interesting to think about that one, and you should as well. So a question I want to leave you with is, what mental models do you use today? Or if you don't have any that you can find that you use today, then maybe what are some that you would inspire to actually use? Put them down in the comments, and I'd like to read about what you have and what you've done in the past with mental models. I hope this was helpful. Give me any suggestions around future topics you'd be interested in. I'll research those, depending on what they are, if they're interesting to me or not. And also subscribe to the newsletter that I have. I've created one, so it'll be somewhere down here that you can subscribe to it, and it'll also be in the blog post itself. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you next week, hopefully. And Merry Christmas to all my Christmas lovers.